I'm having a hard time with my hair. I'm also having a hard time coming up with what I should do the first tutorial on. So, I'm gonna put a hat on my head. Definitely not backwards. That's better. And I'm gonna put some bagels in my stomach. Come with me. This'll work. It's pretty good light in the bagel shop. Pretty good bagels in the bagel shop. I spent today thinking about all the different types of photography that I enjoy shooting, all the different techniques that I would want to teach, and I found myself struggling to figure out the best first tutorial. I thought about nature, wildlife, street photography, long exposure photography, travel photography, underwater photography, tips and tricks, portraits, events. The list goes on. Then it dawned on me, maybe before I start talking about more advanced concepts, I should start with the basics. So you'll hear a bunch of new vocabulary once you start taking photography seriously. For example, you may have heard of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, depth of field, golden hour, happy hour, parallax, Snorlax, snoot, macaroni lens, SLRs, mirrorless, DSLR, film. Actually, you probably haven't heard of all of those vocabulary words because I made 3 of them up and one of them's a Pokemon. Anyway, let's do an overview of the first 3 we talked about: aperture, shutter, and ISO. So first, let's talk about aperture. Aperture is also called f-stop, and it's very similar to the human eye, actually. The iris and the pupil would be the same thing as the lens and the aperture blades inside of the lens. And in this analogy, the sensor of the camera would be the same thing as the retina at the back of your eye. Keep in mind that just like in the camera, your eye's goal is to properly expose an image for your brain to see. And to do that, our brains automatically control our iris and pupil to constrict and dilate based on the light that comes in. And that's the same thing that we're able to let the camera automatically control or manually control to achieve that constriction and dilation of the aperture blades. The more light that's introduced, the tighter our pupil becomes. We're able to see more. We have more focus when our pupil is tighter because there's more light in the image. Conversely, when it's very dark, our pupil dilates. And that's to allow as much light as possible to hit our sensor, our retina. You'll notice when you walk around at night or in dimly lit situations, you have a little bit of issues with your depth. You don't know if something's closer or farther. You stumble a little bit more. And that's the same thing that happens with focus in the camera. The wider your aperture is, the less depth that you get. And this is what people are talking about when they say depth of field. The smaller your aperture is, the more depth that you get. Enough talking about it. I'm going to demonstrate it with you now with this fruit basket. On the 50mm 1.2 lens, with the aperture wide open at 1.2, you see only the apple is in focus here, while the other fruit are out of focus, and the background is completely blurred out. However, when we increase the aperture to 2.0, you see the frame gets darker, but we can see more of the apple and we can start to make out the orange, the banana and the pears. To counteract this, I'm going to decrease my shutter to 1/50th of a second, and I'm going to increase my ISO from 100 to 200. Let's see how increasing the aperture gives us more depth of field. This is aperture at 2.0, aperture at 2.2, 2.5, 2.8, 3.2, 3.5, 4.0, 4.5, 5.0. As you see, as we made the aperture opening smaller, we got more depth of field. We can now see all the way back to the pear, but the exposure of our overall image went down. So we need to do one of three things now. We need to slow down our shutter speed to let in more light, increase our ISO to make the sensitivity of the sensor more, or increase our light source. For the purposes of this exercise, let's increase our ISO 250, ISO 320, ISO 400, ISO 500, ISO 640. That looks good. But you can still see the pear is not quite in focus. So let's see how much higher we have to go on our aperture to get both the apple and the pear in the frame. Again, the frame went dark, so I'm going to increase my ISO to compensate. So in the beginning, we had a starting value of aperture 1.2, shutter speed 60 or 1/60th, and an ISO of 100. In order to get this entire fruit basket in focus, we finished at a value of aperture 9.0, shutter speed 1/50th, ISO 2000. One interesting thing about apertures as well is I've noticed that that's one of the major components of the cost of a lens. For example, Canon has a 50mm 1.8 that runs you about $125 on B&H right now. That's an aperture of 1.8. It's still pretty good. But then if you look at Canon's 50mm 1.4, that'll cost you 3 times as much at around $329. Lastly, if you look at Canon's 50mm 1.2, what we shot the fruit with, that's going to cost you about 3 times as much as the last one, and it comes in around $12.99 right now at B&H Photo. So I've noticed that when you look at the lenses, especially in like focal lengths, price changes when f-stop is able to go lower or closer to 1. I mean, there's also different considerations in the 1.2. There's a slightly better build quality. There's different coatings on the lenses as well as a weather seal. If you think about it, your f-stop gives you the greatest ability to create studio-like situations when you're not in the studio. The idea of a studio is that you can control everything. You can control the background, you can control the lighting, you can control the subject. But when you're out in the real world, that's not always the case. So being able to guide your viewers' eyes to what you want them to focus on is a very important part in the pricing of a lens, apparently.